With its limitless possibilities for color, shape, and inclusions, resin helps you add a personal touch to all your jewelry. In this workshop, mixed media artist Sherri Haab showcases the versatility of resin. She works with purchased molds, casts original designs in silicone, and turns household items into exciting accessories. She creates striking metallic effects with acrylics and mica, and she swirls powders and pigments to cast colorful stripes and layers. In all, Sherri demonstrates 15 unique projects, and she shares sanding and polishing techniques for finishing each piece with a professional look. Now let's join Sherri Haab in resin jewelry.
Hi, I'm Sherri Haab, and welcome to my workshop on making resin jewelry. When you work with resin, you need to make sure you follow proper safety guidelines, and that is very important with any resin product. And remember that this should not be used with children. The first thing that you need to use is a respirator. And this one can be found at any hardware or paint store. And make sure it has the label NIOSH on it, which stands for National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And make sure that you use filters that are for fumes instead of just dust. Another thing that you can use is a dust mask like this, and this will be important to use when you're working with dry powders and pigments because you don't want to be inhaling those. Resin can be an irritant to your skin, and so it's important to use gloves like these, and these gloves are made of nitrile. Don't use latex, which can sometimes react with the resin. You'll want to make sure that they are nitrile gloves, and these can be found at medical supply stores or at arts and crafts supply stores. Wear safety goggles or glasses to make sure that anything that might pop or splat won't hurt your eyes. You always just need to protect them, so use these goggles. For cleanups and spills, these are shop towels that you can find at an auto body supply store, and they're very absorbent and work really great for cleaning up resin. And then when you are working with resin, cover your work surface with a layer of plastic or wax paper, and that'll help you if you spill the resin that it won't soak through and ruin your tabletop. Most importantly, always work in a very well ventilated area and make sure that you follow all of your manufacturer's safety guidelines. You can find a materials safety and data sheet in the packaging that comes with your resin, and it will give you more details about the particular product that you're using. Resin is a common material used in jewelry making. It's used both in commercial jewelry making and in artist one-of-a-kind pieces of jewelry. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the different types of resin and how they're used. The first resin I want to show you is called urethane resin. Urethane resin comes in a two-part component. There's a resin and then a hardener. And resin is actually a liquid plastic, and it becomes solid as soon as the hardener or catalyst is added to start a chemical reaction in which the resin is polymerized and becomes a solid. It's actually heating up in the process. Urethane resin is really great to use when you're working on a big project such as a bangle or a larger casting. And it does have a tendency to set up very fast, so that's a great one to use for big projects. This is epoxy coating resin. And epoxy coating resin is one that you mix 1:1. It should be poured in a very shallow bezel, probably under a 1/4 inch thick. And it's used to coat photos or collage images or a surface that you might want to coat with a clear coating. You can mix in powders, pigments, dyes, and different elements as well, but you do want to use this for your shallow projects or anything that you just want a thin coating of resin on. Clear casting epoxy allows you to pour deep castings with the resin. And you can pour this in molds. You mix it 1:1, and just like the epoxy coating resin, it dries clear, and you can embed little elements into it and add pigments and dyes to color this one. With all of these resins, depending on the manufacturer, they have different curing rates. And the casting resins are dependent on the type. Epoxy resins take a little bit longer to cure than urethanes, and they can range anywhere from a day to 3 days depending on how deep your casting is and the conditions such as the temperature. And all resins do much better in a warmer temperature, above 75 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Resin really likes a warm area to cure. This resin is an epoxy resin that is a quick setting one. The one I like to use is called 2-ton epoxy. You can find this in any hardware store or variety store, and it can be used for jewelry making, both as a decorative element and then also as a tool to attach pin backs or earring backs or any of your jewelry findings. And you just mix it a little bit at a time, pushing with the plunger to get both components out on a little piece of wax paper or foil, and mix it with a toothpick. This type of resin works really well for gluing metal to plastic. So any of your jewelry findings that are metal, you can glue to your resin projects with this type of glue after they have been cured. To color your resin, you can use pigments, and dry pigments are available in arts and crafts supply or art suppliers, and these are used for various types of art media. And each resin manufacturer also carries their own variety of pigments for you to use. With dry pigments, you need to make sure you keep the moisture out of the pigment so it won't inhibit any of the curing of your resin. Pigments also come in a liquid form, and these are 2 colored pigments that are made by the manufacturer to go with the particular resin. Just make sure you use the one that's specified for the resin that it's been formulated for. These can be mixed just like you would mix paints on a palette. Mix a little bit on a sheet of wax paper with a toothpick to get a range of shades just based on your primary colors. The trick when you're using liquid pigments or dyes is not to use too much, because you don't want to throw off the balance of your resin hardener and resin mixtures. Dyes are a way to get a transparent look to your resin, and they come in a liquid form, and just a little will tint a lot of resin and give it a little bit of color that you can still see through if you're using clear resin. And that's used in the same way as the liquid pigments. Just mix a little bit up on some wax paper and mix various colors if you want a palette and a range of colors. For this demonstration, I want to show you how to sand your finished cast resin pieces. And any piece that you cast, you will notice that as you pull it out of the mold, you have rough edges where it came out of the mold that need to be sanded away. This piece is a good example of where I overfilled the mold and I have resin trailing around the edges that I need to remove. So this can be accomplished by sanding the piece. And the way you want to start out is with coarse sandpaper. I have 100 grit normal sandpaper here, or you can use a sanding file like this that has different grits from coarse to fine. And you can find these at any beauty supply store. The sanding file works good on small pieces where I have edges I need to get around, and you simply sand these rough edges away with your coarsest grit to begin with and just take them right off. Be sure that you wear a dust mask whenever you're working with resin shavings. You don't want to be breathing these little pieces of plastic, these little particles. And just keep working around the edge. And then you will move to finer grits to refine the edges of this piece. Let me show you on this bangle bracelet an easy way to sand. I have my 100 grit sandpaper here, and I'm moving around in a circular motion to sand it. It's nice to sand something like a bangle in this fashion because I can leave the sandpaper flat on the table, and it gives me the ability to keep the pressure on it and sand it very quickly. You see, you get your shavings here. The edge is starting to be taken down. We're almost there. I want to make sure I get clear down to where the surface is level here. As you build up dust, you may need to get rid of a little bit of it as it clogs your sandpaper, or get in a fresh piece of sandpaper. As an alternative method, if you have a belt sander that you can quickly take away the high spots, that will work as well, but you don't want to use that as you refine your piece because the pieces of dust and resin will embed back in the surface of the resin. But on the first run, when you're just trying to get the high points away, that would work too. After you've sanded for a while and you need to get some of the areas that weren't quite level, you can work by hand and sand this way too. Keep sanding until you finally see that all of the surface is level. You can feel it with your finger, and you can also see that you've taken off all of the high points here. And now I'm ready to start sanding with wet, dry sandpaper. And I have various grits here of wet dry sandpaper, starting at 220 grit, and then moving on to 320 grit, and then proceeding on to 400, 600, 800, 1,000, and maybe even 1,200 as the final stage if you want to take it that far. Start out with your 220 grit and you put it in a pan of water. And a pan of water works really nicely to use because it keeps the dust down. And you still want to wear a dust mask, but this will keep all the dust contained in your water. And I put the sanding paper face up and take your bangle and sand. Now a little trick on this so that the edges aren't squared off is I will round them a little by holding the bracelet as an angle while I sand, like this. And this will help round the edges. And the same thing for the inside of the bracelet. I can take my paper with my hand and go around and bevel the edge ever so slightly so that the bracelet is very comfortable to wear. Be careful not to sand the areas that you pulled from the mold that are already shiny, because then you have a lot of work to do to try to bring it back up to this shine that you already created when you pulled it from the mold. And then switch to your next grit, which is my 320, and sand in the same fashion. And again, with each progressive grit, you want to do the same motions where you go around the edges, either like this at an angle or on the inside of the bracelet. Because anywhere that you skip to another grit, you'll see the white of the resin where you missed the sanding. And then I'll move to my 400 and so on. This is 400 grit. And you start to feel that this bracelet will become smoother and smoother as you sand each progressive grit. I've made my way through my various grits progressively, and now I'm on my last grit of 1200 as a final one. Clear resin is a bit tricky to sand to be able to get back to that clear shine. So that's why you want to make sure when you pull it from the mold you don't sand any more than you need to. Okay, finish sanding with your 1200 grit and then dry your piece off. Now I'm ready for my last step, car wax. And this works well to give your resin pieces a sheen for the final pass. This wax contains Carnauba. Carnauba is a good wax to use for resin. Use the wax to add a final shine to your resin piece. And you can use this all over your piece if you'd like for a nice finished shine. And the same is true for a piece like this. You would go ahead and use your sanding papers with your hand and sand by hand progressively, and then finish with your wax to get a sheen that you want to your resin. And that's how you finish your pieces so you'll have a professional quality piece when you're done. These funky rings were made with layers of colored resin, and you can layer resin by letting each layer cure a little bit before you add another color. And it's an exciting way to use a mold to get a striped effect. And I have a ring here that shows different layers of resin to make stripes. And if you were to pour your resin one on top of the other while the resin were still uncured, you'd get a swirled effect that might not show your layers. So to do this ring, to make this ring, we're going to use a mold like this. And this mold has little impressions that you can pour your layers of resin. And this mold is called a deep flex mold, and it's made to use with resin, and you don't need a release agent. And this resin that I'm using right now is called Easy Cast because you can pour deep. I have some mixed up here, and I need to add some color to it. So I've poured a little out here. I'll add a little bit more in a separate cup. And then my first layer right here is this light pink color, and that's the first layer I'm going to pour. So I'm going to add a little bit of white. And this white is a pigment that is available from the manufacturer of the resin, and it's compatible with the resin. So just a drop or two. You don't want to add too much or it'll affect the curing of your resin. So just a little bit in here, and stir it around with your stir stick. And to get that violet color, I'm going to need to add a little bit of red and blue. And these are opaque pigments, so let me add just a little tiny drop of red here. And a little bit of blue to get the violet color. You want to make sure that you add the resin dye or pigment and then mix it very, very well. Look at it and make sure that there aren't any colors sticking to the side of your cup that might interfere with the curing of your resin. And after I have that color mixed, I'll go ahead and start in an empty part of the mold here. And just use your craft stick to go ahead and layer just a little bit in the bottom. And that will be my top of my ring. That'll be the first stripe that's on the top of the ring. And if there are any air bubbles, go ahead and use a heat gun and hold it briefly over that to dissipate the bubbles. To add the next layer, which is this purple layer, I've added a little bit of blue and a little bit more red to my mixture to get a darker purple color. I'm going to mix that blue in until I get a violet color for my next layer. Now this layer I poured earlier, and that has set until it is slightly tacky on the surface, and then you know you're ready to add your next layer. So I'll go ahead and take my stick and add another layer. And these colors do not change as it cures. They stay just as true as the day you mix them. And then for my final layer, I've already mixed up a little bit of this hot pink color, and I have the next layer here that's been sitting. And I can go ahead and add the final layer. And I'll just pour this in because I'm going to go ahead and fill it to the top of the mold. You can kind of eyeball it and make sure you don't overfill your mold. Hit it again with the heat gun to make sure you get rid of any of the bubbles that rise to the surface. And then this is ready to go ahead, and as soon as you've filled all of your layers, let this cure in a warm place at least overnight before you release your finished pieces from the mold. To finish our ring, once we've popped out our little ring tops, you need to file off the edge. And I like to use a sanding file like this, starting with a coarse grit of sandpaper and moving to finer, and just go around the edge and take off that lip that formed around the edge of your mold of resin. And if you're using sandpaper, this would be about 220 grit, or if you have a really rough area, you can use 100 grit for this initial sanding just to get the rough edges off. Be sure that when you're sanding, you wear a dust mask because you don't want to be breathing any of the little resin plastic shavings. On this ring, I did something different. I added some little sequins to the layer for just a different idea. You can layer little glitter and sequins and other things into your layers. We will continue sanding it. I've got a tray of water. You want to just use a flat pan or tray of water and start with wet, dry sandpaper in the water. This one's 400 grit because I'm using a little small piece, but if you have a larger piece with a lot of rough areas, you can start with 320 or 360, and I'm going around and sanding the edges of this. This water helps to collect the dust so that you're not breathing it, and it also helps from redepositing the dust back into the resin, because if I were to do this dry, then the plastic particles would embed themselves back into my piece, making little white spots. And after you've gone around the edge once, move to a finer grit. This is 400 and now I'm moving to 600. And then you could go on up to 800 to 1,000, and at 1,200 you're getting a pretty smooth surface. And you can move it around in a circular motion if you need to take any material off the back of your ring as well. And finally, you should have a nice sanded beveled edge that's ready to glue onto your ring back. After you've finished sanding your ring top, you can attach your ring top to little metal findings like this. And this has a flat pad on it that I can glue the ring top onto. So I've got that, and I'm using 2-ton epoxy here, which is really good for metal and plastic. This is an epoxy resin that comes in a dispenser, and you can find it at the hardware store, and you push both components out onto a piece of wax paper or foil, and then use a toothpick to mix them the same way we mix other types of epoxy resin. Be sure, just like when you mix in a cup, to mix this one very thoroughly. As an extra precaution, it's a good idea to sand the top of your ring finding. I can take just a moment to do that. If I have my nail file, and just sort of roughen up the surface, give us something extra for the glue to hold on to. And after that's mixed up, I go ahead and use my toothpick, just a very little drop of that on there, and attach my ring. Well, actually, I'll attach it this way. I like to use this mold as something to hold it with, and so I'll pop my ring top in there, and then just put this ring blank right on the back and center it. And that mold gives me a nice little place to hold it level while that dries. And let that sit at least overnight until your ring is finished. And then your ring should be ready to wear. As an alternative to the striped ring idea, I wanted to show you this mold using these flower shapes with the same idea of layering different colors of resin. And these little rings were made by first pouring a yellow and then another color on top. And we've also added glitter to the resin to give it a sparkly effect. And you can see that I have some in process here where I've poured the first color, which goes down into the center of the flower. And then I have a little resin here which I will add to the flower. And this gives it a second color for the background of the flower. And I'm pouring the Easy Cast epoxy resin right now. And that's kind of a fun idea that you can use that's the same as layering the striped rings. So let that cure, and then I'll show you how to pop these out of the mold. These molds work by simply flexing them and pushing on the back. That center is just having a little trouble coming out there. You can see you can pop your pieces out, and sometimes they just drop out. These molds are very flexible, and that's how you release them from these molds, which are really great. This technique uses an epoxy coating resin, which can be used in very shallow bezels. And on this particular bracelet, we're using collage images to fill bezels that you can purchase in craft stores. And these are just metal bezels that are very shallow, and they're ready to use to fill with your favorite images. You can find images in clip art books. I have some here that are some Halloween images. You can find old postcards and old collectibles and little tiny objects that you can fill your bezels with like this. And I have some confetti and just whatever you want to fill in these bezels. Just remember that they're really shallow, so you don't want to have anything maybe like this that's going to stick up above your resin too much, although that might be a nice effect that you want to use. If you're using something like tissue, then you want to make sure that you seal it really well, and I'll show you in just a minute how to do that, because the tissue tends to bleed into the resin as the ink and the dye comes out of the tissue, so that's something to be mindful of. I have two examples here. One is an inkjet printer, and then this one is a photocopy, which is laser-based, and both of them I've layered coating resin over the surface. And you'll notice that I get a clear effect where the white paper was, which is something that you probably don't want to happen because you sort of lose your contrast and the brightness of your color if you have your white of your paper disappearing. And then also on a laser printer, sometimes it muddies the ink just a little bit. And so what you'll need to do to remedy that is to coat your paper prior to applying the resin. And I like to use Mod Podge, and this is a decoupage medium that you can use to seal your paper before setting it into the bezel. When you're using a sealer, you need to keep in mind the type of copy you're using as well. The problem arises if you're using an inkjet printer and using the decoupage. You'll notice that I have this under the resin. This is resin on top of the Mod Podge, the Mod Podge tends to dissolve the water-based inkjet. And so I think the best way to handle it is to use a laser photocopy, seal it with the Mod Podge, and then apply the resin for the best possible image. And that way you maintain all of your color and you make sure that nothing bleeds. I'm going to be using this circle bezel to put some Halloween images, and I've cut myself a little paper pattern the same size as the inside of the bezel to use. And then when I'm cutting out images, I can just put it over, cut it around the image, and they will fit perfectly. Another idea for this is to use children's art. A child made this for me, this little pumpkin here, and that's something that you can put in your bezel too. I'll demonstrate on this little piece right here how we seal the image before we put it into the bezel. So I'm using a little bit of Mod Podge and use a flat brush. And the first thing you want to do, and this might sound unnecessary, but you really need to go around the edge because that resin tends to find its way into the paper through the edges. So I go completely around the edge and seal that first. The nice thing about decoupage medium is it dries clear, so you don't need to worry about what it looks like at this stage. I can put it on a piece of wax paper that it won't stick to after I'm done, and then coat the top surface. And when this is done, I can just pop it off the wax paper and do the back side as well. So seal both sides really well, and then we're going to go ahead and put it into our bezel. You can see that I have some already in here. I've got a little bit of cellophane, wrapping paper, and I'm layering a few images, and I have one that's ready to go here that I'm going to go ahead and add on top of one that I've already put in the bezel. And then if I want to add something like a little rhinestone or charm, I can just use a little decoupage medium to stick it in there. And you can use little beads or anything you'd like in those bezels. While you're waiting for your images to dry, you can add a few other elements if you want. If you use confetti like this, sometimes the dye that they use to color this will bleed into your resin. So I've coated this one with Mod Podge prior to setting it into the bezel as well. So just add a little bit on both sides, which I've already done, and just a little bit to glue it into the bezel. And now I've got my dried image ready to stick down into my bezel. So just add a little bit more glue. And I've already coated the back side of this, so I'm not too worried about getting it all over the bezel, just enough to hold it down in here. And now I'm ready to fill the bracelet with resin. To mix epoxy or urethane resin, there are two components, and I've got equal parts of resin and harder in these two cups here, and the cups that I'm using have measurements on the side so that you can fill it up exactly to the line of the milliliters or teaspoons or however you're measuring your resin. So I've got the same amount in both, and it's important to measure those accurately. I'm going to pour both components into one cup to mix them. Make sure you get all of the resin out of both cups or out of the bottle that you're measuring from. And begin stirring the resin. Use a stir stick, and what you want to do is you want to stir, not whip the resin, or you will introduce a lot of air bubbles and it makes it harder to release after you've poured your resin. So work around, stirring for a few minutes, scraping the sides of the cup, making sure that you incorporate both really well. Now, as an insurance policy that this resin is going to set up, I always use another cup and pour what you've already mixed into the clean cup and stir it one more time. And this might seem like an extra step, but you can never tell if you just have a little bit of one of the resin or the hardener sticking to a corner of a cup. And that's all it takes to ruin a project and have your resin be slightly tacky. after you finish your project. So I have another cup there, and I'm going to stir this one well again. After your resin is mixed, I'm ready to go ahead and add the coating resin to my project. Place your project on a sheet of wax paper, and now I can begin to add the resin to each of these bezels. And I just use my stir stick here to drop the resin into the bezel. Now, because these bezels are so shallow, I really don't need a lot, just enough to coat the image. And I have a toothpick here to move the resin around. This type of resin will also self-level as it cures, so that'll flatten out. Fill each of your bezels. Now, as these are leveling, you'll notice that you have some bubbles that you need to get rid of. And you can use a heat gun, which can be found at a rubber stamp store or craft store. And these are used to emboss embossing powder for rubber stamps. Use your heat gun to hold directly over your bezel. And you will notice that it gets rid of those bubbles really quickly, and it also helps to push the resin out to the edge of the bezel. If you see any little areas where you need to just add a little bit more with a toothpick, you can fill in and keep working like that. Now, to add a little bit of sparkle to these, I can sprinkle a little glitter into the wet resin. And this gives dimension to your pieces and gives you a fun effect. And I could add little rhinestones if I wanted at this stage, and they will just sit in the resin. I have a little black glitter. You can just sprinkle it in your images, and if you need to push the glitter around at all, use a toothpick and move anything around that you need to at this stage while the resin is still curing. And now we're ready for this to sit and cure. Keep this in a level place that is very warm. Resin likes to cure when it's very warm, maybe 75 degrees or higher. You don't want to bake it or anything, but just keep it under a light bulb or in a warm area. And leave it there for at least 2 to 3 days for your resin to cure properly. And at least overnight. At overnight, you will be able to pick it up, but make sure that you don't touch it or it'll be a little sticky. And then you will be able to wear your bracelet after a few days. This little charm was made with a found object game piece filled with miniature people that you can find at a hobby store or somewhere that sells miniatures. You can look around your house for odds and ends and old game pieces. I have a few right here that are from games. Bottle caps work well. You can find a lot of little parts, a lot of little hardware parts, and anything that has an opening with edges on it, with a side to it, can be used as a bezel to fill with resin. I've got one here in progress that's made with a game piece that's like this. It's just a little plastic piece with edges, and I'll fill it with a little collage scene in here. And to start, what I'm using is a few road maps or old postcards that I've copied on the computer. And then I'm using color copies that have been laser printed so that my inks won't run. But before I start, I need to go ahead and seal the images with a little Mod Podge. And this will be my background for my piece. So go ahead and make sure you seal the edges well. And go ahead and cover both sides really well and let that dry. And I'm going to go ahead and place it inside of my game piece here. You can use the end of your paintbrush or toothpick to lay this in here. Now I'm going to let that dry thoroughly, at least overnight, and make sure that the glue is completely dry before I layer my resin in there. Before you glue your little pieces and your collage images into your game piece, I drill a hole through the top, and I'm using a vise like this and a hand drill like this. This is a Fisker's drill, works the best for going through plastic. If you use an electric drill, it will melt the plastic onto the drill bit because it goes too fast. And so when you're drilling plastic, you really want to use a hand drill. Go ahead and drill right through the top of this to make a hole because we're going to add a wire for hanging. Now that I have the hole drilled, I just want to go ahead and clean out the shavings and clean that up, and I'm ready to insert my wire. And just take some wire like this and clip it off and make a loop. And you'll see that I have one that's done here, where I've just made a loop and then left the tail ends of the wire on the inside. And I won't be too worried about if it's going to pull out because the resin that I'm pouring in here will hold the wire in place inside. Now to add the little people, you can just add a little bit of glue. Mod Podge also works as a glue. And adhere them inside your scene. These charms make a really cute idea to hang off of a backpack or a purse or a keychain. It'd be fun to do different themes for holidays. You can find reindeer or holiday themed miniatures that you could make for a special occasion. Even photos would work well in here as long as you copy them. And after I've glued anything I want in there, I will let that dry thoroughly again overnight before I pour the resin in. So let's fill this one with resin here. I have my people glued and my collage image in the background. And on this project, I'm using Easy Cast casting epoxy resin because you can pour it deeply into the bezel. And I have some mixed up here that I'll add. Use a craft stick to layer the epoxy into your bezel, let it flow down around the edges, and keep adding epoxy until it fills up the whole surface. And now if you have any air bubbles, I'll show you how to remove those in just a minute. Use a toothpick to go ahead and move this resin around the objects. My resin's starting to get a little too thick here because I've let it sit out for a while. And normally your resin will just flow in around your objects. Okay, so fill it there. To remove any of the air bubbles that you have, go ahead and use a heat gun like this. Hold it over the surface and turn it on to release the bubbles as they dissipate on the surface. After you've removed most of the bubbles, you can try to poke out any remaining ones with a toothpick here. As that cures, more of the bubbles will release on their own as the resin sits for a while. And go ahead and let that sit for at least 3 days in a warm environment. And I sit it under a warm light bulb or something like that so it can stay above 75 degrees Fahrenheit in a warm place. Make sure you don't touch it. And as soon as you can tap on it with your fingernail, you know that that is ready to turn into a keychain or a dangle that you can hang off of a purse or backpack. For this bracelet, I'm using clear resin, acrylic paint, paint with metallic iridescence to it, and then opaque resin to back these with. And these are poured into a mold in reverse order. And so this technique is a reverse painting technique. These molds have these little square shapes in it, and that's what I'm going to use. And you will be pouring this in reverse order. So I have a little bit of clear casting resin mixed up here, and I'll pour just a little bit. And this is going to be the top of my bead here for the bracelet. And pour it about half full like that. And I'm going to go ahead and let that cure for a while. And I have one that's been curing right here. And as soon as it's cured and you can tap on it and it's nice and hard, maybe a day or two later, and that's ready to go, then you can paint a design. And you start with your outline. And I'm using a little bit of gold metallic paint. This is just normal acrylic paint and a small pointed brush to paint a little design right on the resin. Now instead of using a paintbrush and gold paint, you can use those markers, paint markers if you'd like, that come with metallic colors, or you can use black if you're going to back it with another color. Paint this little heart shape. I've got an outline there that I'm going to fill with color. And let that one dry thoroughly before you add your next color. Now I've used gold on this one, and on this example I'm showing you black acrylic paint with the same idea, and I'm going to fill that with different colors. And I'm just using acrylic paints, doesn't matter what brand you use. Now on this design, obviously I'm not going to use a black background or I would lose my design. So if I were to back this with white or a light yellow or a different color, that would be something that would make those black lines show up. And you just fill in the little areas with color. And you don't have to be neat because it will be viewed in reverse, so you only see the outline on top of the paint. It's just like a coloring book. You just fill in the blanks, center of the flower there. And then you want that to dry. To check my design, I'm going to hold it up and look under there and make sure that I filled in all the areas within the lines to make sure that my design is ready to go. And I'll set that aside. I have one here that I painted a heart shape, just like the example I showed you, and filled it in with color. And now we're going to back this with resin. And I've mixed up some opaque black here. I've just added a little bit to my epoxy casting resin. Mix your pigment in really well. And this is a nice dark black pigment that comes in a liquid form from the manufacturer of the resin. And use a toothpick to help pour the resin into that mold. You don't want to overfill it, but you do want to fill it up to the top. And then if there are any bubbles that I see that come to the surface, I love to use my heat gun to just take a quick pass over the top of it and release any of those bubbles that might remain. Let this cure at least overnight or a few days until you can tap on it and it feels hard and ready to release from the mold. After your resin has completely cured, you can go ahead and pop your little pieces out of your molds. And you notice that you have a lip here that needs to be sanded off. And to start, use a nail file. This has got 4 different grits on it. You can just get that at a beauty supply store and file off your first edge. And this is a very coarse grit to get most of the material off so that I can refine it by using finer grits to continue sanding. Be sure and put your dust mask on when you're sanding plastic. Round these corners off too. And then you can go ahead and place this in a pan of water and start with 320 wet dry sandpaper, move to 400, 600, 800, and 1000 and keep working these edges until they're smooth. And you can see that I've worked on this finished piece until these edges are nice and smooth. To make the links to connect the pieces of the bracelet, you need to drill a hole through here. And this is a little bit tricky, these pieces are small. Use a hand-held pin vise like this to drill a hole. And I hold my fingers on both sides so I can feel where the drill's going through. And if you feel a little bit of a bulge, you know you're getting too close to one side or the other. And you can drill through like this. It takes a little bit. Pop out on the other end. You can see your drill. One method that is much faster is if you have access to a drill press, that works great for drilling through beads. Make sure that your drill is on a slow speed because at a higher speed it tends to melt the plastic on the drill bits and makes it much harder to drill through. Now to add the wire, I'll slip this wire through here. I'm just using a brass craft wire and I'm bending it over at a 90-degree angle like this and leaving quite a bit here so I have something to work with. And then you use round nose pliers to make a loop. Wrap it around halfway, then take your finger to wrap it the rest of the way. And you'll twist it around. Just using my finger to twist it around a couple of times. And then I use my wire cutters to cut off the excess. And then that will be ready to add my next link to. Do one same on the other side. Bend it over. Oops, I'll start with my round nose so I don't waste my extra wire here. make your loop and wind it around a few times. And clip off the excess. And for my next link, I will go ahead and make the loop, but I won't wrap it yet because I'll be adding the beads to each other, and each one is linked to the next one. And as they lay flat, the wires will turn inside so that the loops are perpendicular to each other so that the bracelet will remain flat. And then you just add a loop and toggle or whatever clasps you want, and make sure that you add enough links and enough pieces until it fits around your wrist, and you have your completed resin painted bracelet. These earrings were made with real leaves embedded in resin, and you can use real leaves and real dried flowers as long as you have them thoroughly dry to embed in resin to make jewelry. In these bezels, I've left the background clear so that you can see all the way through the resin. First of all, make sure that your flowers again are very dry, and these have been pressed for a while. You don't want any moisture in anything that you collect from outside, or it'll interfere with your resin. And bright colors like these flowers would be best if you would seal them with decoupage medium, such as Mod Podge, because the bright colors especially tend to bleed into the resin. To make the little leaf earring, I have a piece of acetate, which is a plastic that will not stick to resin. And to prepare this little bezel, I have a bezel that has a hole in the top, and that's what I will use to hook onto my earring after I've completed it. To make this attach to start, I'm using a little white glue and putting it around the base of the pin and sliding this up just to glue it temporarily in place until I get the resin in there to hold it. And then the trick to having a clear resin bezel is to attach the bezel onto the acetate. And to do this, I'm adding a bead of glue around the bezel. And then glue this onto your acetate. And to make sure that I've got a good seal there, I'll take my toothpick and run a bead around the outside to make sure I have a good barrier. And this will keep my resin from leaking out anywhere. And let this dry really thoroughly. After you've completed your piece, the glue just peels right off. Make sure you look at it carefully and make sure you've got the glue around the edges. Now that can sit to dry till we are ready to fill it with resin. You'll know when it's dry as soon as your glue turns clear. So we'll set this one aside. I have this bezel that's been glued to the acetate and it's dry, and I'm going to add a little flower to match my earrings and make this into a necklace. And I have a batch of clear casting epoxy resin that I've mixed up, and I just use my craft stick to go ahead and fill this bezel about half full. It doesn't take much for something this tiny. And to release the bubbles, give it a quick hit with your heat gun. And more of those bubbles will go away as it cures. And I have picked out a little dried flower to fit in the center here. And dried flowers are easier to pick up if you have some tweezers. And plop it right in the resin, and it should float on the surface because flowers are light enough to float on the top of the resin. And just let that sit until that is cured to add the second layer. And it doesn't have to be fully cured. I would maybe wait 6 or 8 hours, and then you can add the next layer of resin, or even overnight on that. So I'll set that aside. Now I want to show you how you can add a little eyelet through the top of that clear resin to make a clever necklace. Here's a piece where I have the same bezel, but I've used a little brass charm that I've embedded, and this has some other little collage pieces inside. There's a little sequin. And what I'm using are these little eyelets, and they're extra long, and I'm going to insert it right through a hole that I've drilled. So go ahead and drill a very tiny hole through your resin, and then insert this eyelet. I've pushed this one in already, and it fits perfectly through that hole. So make sure your drill bit matches your eyelet. And using a board for eyelet setting and an eyelet setting tool, put it right on your eyelet. And use a hammer and you can pound the eyelet right into the resin. And then you have a little eyelet that makes a nice finish for hanging your necklace. To complete this pair of earrings, I've got a layer of resin that I've let cure part of the way with the little leaf on top. And now I'm adding my final layer to fill the rest of the bezel. And just use a craft stick to drop that in. And then I'm going to let this cure in a warm place until the resin is completely cured. After it's cured, I can remove my piece from the acetate and clean up any of the glue that you see around the edge just by peeling it off with my fingertips. And then I'll use pliers to make a little loop with this wire that you see and hook it to a pair of purchased ear wires to complete the pair of earrings that will go with my finished flower necklace. This daisy pendant has been filled with resin that is tinted and colored with colorful pigments, and then little inclusions added to add sparkle and color. And the pendant that I'm using was made with silver metal clay, but you can buy a purchased pendant if you'd like, or anything that has a bezel wall to it. So we're basically filling a bezel, and we're going to be using epoxy coating resin because it can be used very shallow in bezels like this. And I have some that I've mixed up here, and I'm going to be mixing color with that. Now the color that I'm using is called Pearlex powder, and this is colored pigment that's been mixed with a little pearlescent flakes to give an iridescent quality to it. And it will add color to your resin, so that's really a fun product to use. You want to make sure that your pigments are dry, or that if you use liquid pigments, that they're compatible with the resin that you're using. And always wear a dust mask when you're working with the pigments. To make a palette of color, I just have a little bit of pigment powder here, and I'm just using a craft stick to carefully lift some out and place it on the wax paper. Make sure you don't get a lot of dust up in the air there, and make sure you've got your mask on. And to make the palette of colors, I'll just drop a little bit of resin into each color here. I'm working on wax paper, which is a good non-stick surface for the resin so that you won't affect your countertop. This resin gives me about an hour's working time after I've mixed it, so it'll stay liquid for a while. Okay, and then after you've dropped your resin onto your pigment, you can take a little toothpick and mix the colors into the resin. You'll see that these pigments are pretty strong. They color to an opaque color. If you want to add less for a clear color, you can do that as well. And I'm liking this turquoise. I think I'll start with that one. And to fill the bezel, just take your mixed pigment and resin and go ahead and drop it into one of your bezel areas. The scrapbook store is a good resource for bezels, or you can find them online. And use a toothpick to push the resin around to the edges. I think I'll mix up a little bit of this pink here. The pigment powders also come in metallic colors such as gold and silver and white, so you could pick a whole nother color theme if you'd like that. And then you can continue filling each of those petals with different colors. And I'm going to show you how to add a little bit of color and inclusions at this stage. These are little glass seed beads. I'm just going to use tweezers and drop into the resin. Or you can use a little bit of glass glitter. So I'll drop it into the pink here. Be careful if you use plastic glitter or plastic beads because they can tend to react or sort of melt into the resin. If you use a rhinestone, such as this one, make sure that it's a glass rhinestone because those stay color fast and don't melt into the resin. I can add a little rhinestone here if I can pick it up. Use a toothpick to scoot them over. This could be a lot of fun to add a lot of different elements. I have a little bright glitter here. Add that to the resin. If your glitter is heavy, such as a glass glitter, it tends to sink like this one did into the bottom of the resin. And what you can do is just watch your resin as it starts to gel and set up. Add the glitter at a later stage as this is becoming thicker, and then the glitter will tend to stay near the top. And continue with your other colors and we'll finish the rest of the daisy. If you want to mix your pigment powders, you can mix different colors together and get a neat effect, a neat swirl effect with your resins. And then we've got all of the elements added into the resin, and this can sit in a level place in a very warm area for at least 72 hours while the resin cures. This bangle bracelet was made using a purchased mold, and in it I've layered clear resin with sequin inclusions and a little bit of color to add a stripe for interest. And we'll start with a purchased mold, and this is a deep flex mold that's made for bangles. And I've mixed up some casting resin, and you can either use epoxy casting resin or polyurethane casting resin. Just make sure that you follow the manufacturer's instructions for the amount of catalyst you need to add for the first layer, or in this case, I've mixed epoxy resin 1:1. And I'll add my first layer by pouring this into the channel. Pour it in one place and just let the resin find its way around. And you want to fill the mold about 1/3 full. Don't worry about drips, they pop off the mold later. And I'll swirl this around and make sure the resin is level here. I'm not going to worry too much about the bubbles because I'm going to be adding my sequins at this point. And this type of mold does not need a mold release. So I'm starting with tweezers to just add these colorful little sequins around the edge for the design. Just go ahead and plop them in. You could add a lot of different materials here, materials from nature, or you could add little pieces of string or ribbon, wire, anything that's little enough to fit in this bangle mold. Go all the way around the edge, adding these sequins. Don't worry if one needs a little help. I will get in there with a toothpick and move them around as needed. Keep working until you get the sequins all around the edge. I think I've just about got them in there. Use a toothpick if any of them are stuck to the edge or aren't participating in getting in a row here. And I think that looks pretty good. I think I might need to add one where there's a little hole here. It's kind of fun if they tilt every which way. And then you want to let that sit until it gels. And the way to tell if it gels is you can take a toothpick and tap it on the top of the resin. And right now it's very liquid because we just embedded the sequins. But as it gels, you will see that it's almost like a gelatin state, and the toothpick won't penetrate the liquid. And then you know you're ready for your next layer. You can always let that sit overnight just to make sure that you have a nice cured layer there. So we'll set this one aside. I have one that's been sitting for a while, and you can tell on this one that I'm hitting the resin and it's not liquid at this stage. And I'm going to add my striped layer at this stage. Now I've been mixing some more casting resin, and into this mix I've added a little red pigment and some white to make a hot pink color. And make sure that your pigments are well mixed. If I can see any of the color not mixed in, I've got to work it in, or that will inhibit your resin from curing. Scrape the side of your cup really well to make sure that you have all that pigment off the edges. And when that's mixed, I'm ready to add my next layer. And again, just pour it in the side, letting the resin flow around the edge. You can help it around by tilting the mold. We need to add a little bit more. And then on this layer, if you see any residual bubbles that you need to get out, go ahead and give it a quick touch with your heat gun to make sure you release all of your bubbles. Some of them are releasing on their own. And I can look at this from the side and make sure that it's the thickness that I want the stripe. Make sure you don't tip it towards you and get it in your eye, and make sure you're wearing eye protection when you're working with that. And then let this layer sit and cure until I'm ready to add the final layer. And the final layer is added in the same manner as the first layer, where I just pour a layer of clear resin to the level of the mold and then add the sequins the same way I did with the tweezers going around. And then you let the whole thing set for several days. You want to make sure that your bangle is nice and cured before you try to release it from the mold. So that one's ready to go. After your resin has fully cured in your mold and you have all of your layers, I have my first layer, my striped layer, and then my last layer where I added the sequins again, and you've released it from your mold, you're ready to finish your piece. And this piece was finished by simply sanding the edges with a coarse grit of sandpaper, and then I used wet, dry sandpaper in progressively finer grits to sand the edges and make sure that you round the edges of your bracelet so that it's nice and comfortable when it's on your wrist and you don't have any sharp edges. As a final step, I used a little bit of wax car polish to add a final sheen to this bracelet to make sure that it stays nice and clear like that. And when you've finished polishing it, you are ready to wear your sequin layered bangle. I have an old button that was collected that's out of Bakelite, and I want to make a replica of this with resin. And by making a mold, you can pick up every detail that you have in your piece. The pieces that I made replicas of, one resembles tortoise shell, and I used a clear resin with amber and brown colors in it. And then the other one uses opaque white and pink tints to make a vintage light pink colored opaque button. The product I'm using to make the mold is called silicone putty, and it comes in 2 parts, and this putty can be mixed to make the mold. Here's what the product looks like. This is a Lumelite brand, but there are several different brands, and you mix equal parts of each color to make the mold. This works at room temperature, so pinch off equal amounts of each putty and knead them thoroughly with your fingers. And you'll know your material is ready when you see one uniform color. This only gives you about 5 minutes working time, and so you need to go a little bit fast on this. It's great for molding lots of dimensional objects because it's very flexible once you have the finished mold made. This putty falls in the rubber silicone family of types of molds that you can use for resin. The great thing about this material is it doesn't stick to the resin either, which is another bonus. And you can see that I've almost got a uniform color. In fact, I think it's ready. Roll it into a ball and make sure your object's ready to go. And place it on a table like this and flatten it out slightly. And then I'm going to push my button deeply into the mold here and use my fingers around the outside to surround the button to make sure that you get all of the edges of that button. Now this will set up in about 5 minutes, so I just need to let it sit, and I'll know when it's done when my fingernail does not leave an indentation. So right now it leaves an indentation, but in a few minutes it will bounce back and I'll know that my button's ready to remove from the mold. So I'll just let that sit. After my rubber mold has cured, I'm ready to remove the original button that I used to make the mold. Remember that we tested it by pushing your fingernail into it, and you can see that if I push my fingernail in, it bounces right back out of the rubber. And to flex this out, it's really easy. It practically falls out because this mold material is so forgiving. So I've got my original here that I can save, and I'm ready to go ahead and cast my resin into this mold. And on this I've chose a pigment that's a violet color, and I'm using a urethane resin, and mix a little bit in with your part A to begin with. This will help me get the pigment powder mixed in really well. It only takes a little bit of pigment to tint a lot of resin. You can use a dye if you'd like your button to be transparent like the amber colored one. Get some neat effects. Or you could use 2 colors and marble them together. After your pigment's mixed in, then mix equal amounts of each part A and part B, and I'll add to this. You look at my lines on my cup here, and you want to hold it level while you add your resin. Polyurethane resin only gives you about 30 seconds working time to stir it, so you want to work quickly before it starts to set up. Scrape the side of your cup as you're stirring your two parts together. And as the chemical reaction takes place, you'll feel the cup start to warm up a little bit as the resin is heating up. Polyurethane resin comes in several formulations. The one I'm using is sort of an ivory color, and so that gives your final product that as a base color. Or it comes in crystal clear, or some manufacturers make a black polyurethane resin that's black to begin with, or pure white. And you can't tell until they've set up what color they are just by looking at it. So make sure you read your bottles and that you have the right one you're working with. Okay, after that's thoroughly mixed, I'm going to pour it into my mold. And we can watch it as it begins to turn opaque. We'll know that it's working and that the chemical reaction is taking place and that our resin is curing. So we'll let that sit for just another few minutes, and to be sure, maybe a good half hour to an hour. I have one here that I made earlier that I'm going to pull out of the mold, and you can tell that this one is ready to pull when you get a nice wrap on it. Actually, I'll use a little stick and let you hear the sound. It should make a nice click sound like that, and then you know your resin is completely and thoroughly cured. And it will flex right out of the mold like that. And before I attach my pin back to finish this, I can just use a nail file to refine my edges, and I'll go ahead and just sand around the edges. And this will give you a nice finished professional look to your finished piece. And I'm starting with a coarse grit just to get rid of that lip that was left from the mold. You can see there's just a little bit of an edge. And this sanding board is nice because I have different grits to work with. And I can keep moving around using the various grits, and then use your finer sanding papers to complete it until it's as smooth as you'd like that to be. So I have my finished piece here after I've completed sanding all of the edges. And then to add the pin back, I'm using 2-ton epoxy resin, 2 parts, and mixing it with a toothpick really thoroughly here. I like 2-ton epoxy because it works really well when you're gluing metal findings onto cured resin. Mix it for just a minute or so to make sure you have both parts thoroughly mixed. And then I have this purchased pin back, which is just a jewelry finding that you can find at a craft store to attach to the back of this pin. And I'll just add a little epoxy here. And just attach my pin back to the back of that. Set that down in your mold, and you can use that to just hold it while it dries, and that's a little trick to keeping your pieces level. Let this sit overnight, and then as soon as the resin is cured, to hold the pin back in place, you can wear your finished pin. You can use resin to create stone effects that look like granite or rock by simply adding some inclusions into the resin. And we're going to be making a bracelet that looks like granite, that's black, by adding some fillers, and then rose-colored quartz by adding some transparent resins, and then lapis lazuli by adding some pigment powders. And I'm going to show you how to make this bracelet first off that looks like black granite. And to start off, I've made myself some little molds, and these were made out of rubber silicone putty, and I just used purchased beads that I found at a craft store to create these molds. So the putty was molded around the bead, and then the bead was flexed out and left to make these little molds here. The thing you want to remember though is just to leave a wide area of your bead so that you can get the bead out. But these do give you quite a bit of flexibility. You can stretch them and push on the back and have a lot of room to move to get the bead out. So that's what I'm going to use for the mold here. I've mixed up a little bit of casting epoxy, and I've mixed the 2 parts already. And then there's a black granite powder that is available from ETI, who makes easy cast resin. And this is meant to go with the resin. And what you want to do is measure out equal parts. And so I've filled these cups with equal amounts of resin and black granite. And before adding the powder, I'm going to add a little bit of black pigment just to get a different color here. a darker color of granite to my resin and mixing that well. These granite powders come in a variety of colors. You can get a sand color, a rose color. There's even a white color, but this one what we're using is black, even though it looks white in the cup. Be sure when you're working with the powder that you wear a dust mask. You don't want to be getting any of that dust in your face when you're working. It's not good to breathe. So add the powder to the resin and mix the two parts together. Make sure all of your powder is thoroughly mixed here. You notice there's a little bit of grainy texture to it, which adds to the look of these granite rocks. Scrape the side of the cup and make sure you've got it all. And then drop the granite mixture into your molds. Just using the craft stick to add a little at a time here. And these can be filled to the top. This same technique can be used to create jade or amber techniques. There's a variety of other stones that you can look at and see how they were colored and try to replicate it in resin. It's a really fun thing to do. If you're making a bracelet, you'll probably want to make several molds and then pop out the shapes and fill them as needed until you have enough for the bracelet. Now after I've finished, I have this mold that I've popped out the little piece, and then I've drilled a hole through this. And you can drill a hole either using a handheld drill that won't be a fast speed, or you can use a drill press, and you want to drill at a slow speed so that you don't get plastic melted on your drill bit. And drill through each of those. These pieces should take overnight to cure, and then you can tell by just tapping on the top of them, and you'll know that when they're ready to release from the mold. After you've drilled your piece, then you can sand the edges, and you'll notice that you have a little lip here where they came out of your molds. Go ahead and use a file to sand off the edges using a very coarse grit, and then put it in water and sand with wet, dry sandpaper, starting at 320, working to 400, then to 600 and to 800, beveling the edges as you sand. And then when that's sanded, you'll be ready to string them on your bracelet. After I've sanded all of my pieces and drilled the holes through them, I've strung them on a piece of elastic to create the finished piece. To make other effects like this rose or cherry quartz effect, instead of using granite powders, what I've used is transparent resin, and then I mixed up a very little bit in a separate container of very light red and a little yellow added to make a peach colored resin. And then you fill your little molds with the clear and slowly stir in your red colored resin with a toothpick, making sure to just swirl it and not to mix it thoroughly. And you get these swirled effects in your beads to look like quartz. Another stone you can make is lapis lazuli, and this is made with the same granite powder, a little of the black granite powder, and then ultramarine blue pigment powder mixed in to the clear resin. And this is actually where ultramarine blue comes from, is the lapis stone, so you're getting that exact color of the stone in your resin. And I've added a few specks of gold leaf in these. Let's see if you can see it here. Just add a few little pieces of that to give an authentic look. And then these pieces were drilled at the top to make pendants or a charm that you can hang from a cord or chain. So you can see that there are a lot of effects you can create with stone, and just use your imagination and a little bit of powders and fillers and pigments and come up with all sorts of variations on stones. Polymer clay has been used to make these beads filled with resin and images, and I've used the polymer clay to make indentations for the resin to sit over these little dictionary words that I've got on this beaded necklace. You notice on these beads that I have layered resin over these little dictionary words that are cut out of the dictionary, and I've made the beads to be double-sided. You can see I've got one word on one side with resin covering it, and one on the other, and then they're strung on a cord to make a necklace. I'm using white Primo clay for this project, but you can use any type of polymer clay that you choose to. I'm just kneading the clay to soften it up a bit and roll it into a ball. Okay, to make the two-sided bead, I've got a nice round shape here, and I'm using these two half-sphere acrylic pieces that will help me make my indentations on both sides. To help so that they won't stick, I have a little talc powder that I will put on these. And this will make them easier to remove from the polymer clay. This is just like baby powder. Put some on each one. And then I'm sticking one of these half spheres on each side of the polymer clay, pushing it in. And then use your thumb to go around the edge, forming the bead. And I'm not too worried about this looking perfect. I want this bead to look a little bit rough. And while you still have these half spheres on both sides, I'm going to make the hole with a needle tool. Take your needle tool and push it through the clay, twisting it. And it always helps if you put your finger, you don't want to poke yourself, put your finger on the other side and you can kind of figure out where you should come out here. I've got a hole going through both ways. Don't worry if you see a little place through the acrylic where the needle tool has gone through the clay. You'll be covering that with your image. And then remove these, rocking it out. And I can kind of straighten the edges out a little bit. A little trick is to go ahead and let that sit in the refrigerator for a few minutes to firm up and to chill the clay because it's become really warm and soft with your hands, and then you can bake it. You can clean up the edges a little bit. And you notice I have a little split, but I'm not worried about that right now because I'm going to cover that with my image. When your bead is done, put it on a baking towel on a little sheet of clean paper or a glass baking dish and bake this at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for about a half an hour. I have one that's been baked right here and finished. You notice it has indentation on both sides. And I'm using an old dictionary that I got at a thrift store and cutting out little words like this. And I've coated both sides of these with decoupage so that the resin won't make the image go clear or bleed at all. So make sure you've coated those and let them dry. Use a little bit more decoupage on the back of each of these and attach them inside the bezel. Use the end of my paintbrush to tap that in there. And turn it around and do one on the other. Or you can use an image. Let these dry really well, preferably overnight, because you don't want your resin getting in contact with any moisture that might be remaining. So let that dry thoroughly. After my little collage images have dried and the glue is dry here, I'm going to refine this piece. I can sand the edges of my polymer clay a little bit if I need to. And I've used a 320 or 360 grit sanding paper to refine the edges. This leaves the polymer clay with sort of a matte surface, but if you want it shinier, you could polish it a little bit more with other sandpapers. I want the matte surface because I like the contrast with the resin being shiny and the polymer clay being matte. To make sure that my holes are nice and even, I've got a pin vise like this with a small drill bit, and I go through the holes just to make sure that my needle, after baking it and handling it, that my needle tool left a hole that's big enough. So go through each side, drilling out the polymer clay, making sure you have a hole for stringing later. I'm checking both sides to make sure that everything looks good. And then I'm ready to add my resin. And I'm going to be using clear casting resin on this because my well is a little deep. And just use your craft stick to drop the resin over the images. It's real tricky because sometimes you want to work with a drop at a time to not overfill these because it's a lot harder to clean up an overfill when you have the resin dripping above the polymer clay. If I have any air bubbles remaining, I can use a heat gun to quickly hold it over the top of that and release any air bubbles that are remaining. Let this cure overnight and then turn it over and go ahead and fill resin on the other side. Just make sure before you flip it over that this has a nice tap and that the resin's cured so you don't have it sticking to anything. As an insurance, I always put a piece of wax paper down when I flip it over to make sure that the resin won't stick if I'm working on the other side. And then this is ready to cure for several days. And then you complete the piece by simply stringing cord through the holes, or use these elements in a collage art piece that you might be working on. That might be a fun idea to try. Just any number of uses for this technique. This technique uses an open bezel so that you can see an image all the way through the resin, and I'm using transparencies for this idea. The bezel is made similarly to the nature pendant, the little fern earrings that you can see in another project. And I've started out by gluing a found bezel onto a piece of acetate, just like we did in that project. And I just used white glue to glue it onto the acetate. Previous to putting it on acetate, I drilled a hole and put a little metal hook, a wire twisted through, and just left the end of the wire on the inside where it will be held in place with resin. Transparencies can be just made on your copier or laser printer, and these are just black and white transparencies on transparency film. And I filled the base of this glued bezel with a little bit of resin after the glue has dried really well. And be sure that you put a little bit of glue under your wire to make sure that you have any holes sealed up so the resin won't leak out. And I've already put a little bit of resin down here, and I'm going to drop this transparency into the middle. So I'll add just a little bit more resin. The resin I've added previously has had a chance to set up and gel for a few hours so that this transparency will be suspended in the middle of my bezel. And just use your craft stick to apply a little bit of resin. It will level out, but you can use your stick to push it around a bit. This transparency doesn't need to be treated with any decoupage medium. It's ready to go as is. So you just cut it to the shape of your bezel and drop that in. And I'm going to use a toothpick to tap it down a little bit around the edges. Get it around my hook here. And at this stage, you want to make sure that you see if there are any air bubbles that you can see through the transparency, and tap it with your toothpick to make sure you release all of the air bubbles. And then set this aside to cure for several hours, and then you can fill the top up with the rest of the resin. On this necklace, this finished one, you can see that I filled both sides with resin. This was the initial side that I had adhered to my acetate, and you can see where I've taken the glue off after I've taken it off the acetate. You can just pick it off with your fingernails and take off any tracings of glue that you see here. And this particular bezel is just it looks like a wheel from a child's toy, but anything you can find that is a hollow form like that can act as a bezel for your resin. Okay, now we have one that's been drying for a while and it's been curing, and you can add the rest of your resin to fill up the bezel. And I'm using 2-part casting epoxy, which is what you'll use if you have a deep bezel. Go ahead and fill it up to the level of the top of the bezel. Any bezel that's about 1/4 inch or deeper, then you can use a casting resin rather than a coating resin. But for shallow bezels, a coating resin would be just fine to use here. And that's ready to go ahead and let sit at least overnight, and preferably a few days in a very warm area. Keep that at room temperature or even under a light bulb. Put it in a box and have a little lamp over the top, and the heat will help to cure this faster. So set that aside and go ahead and cure that. And then when you're done, you've got your completed pendant with your transparency that you can see all the way through the resin. To finish your completed piece, attach a cord that matches your design, and you're ready to go ahead and add your jewelry findings and complete your pendant. This uses the transparencies in a different way. I have a purchase mold here that I've filled half with resin and then used a transparency. And so this one's half full right now, and it's been cured. And I'm going to add a background piece to this. So I'll add a little bit of resin to fill the back up. Remember, these are in reverse is how we're creating it. Hit it with the heat gun. And then on this design, rather than leaving it clear all the way through, which you could just add a little eyelet or a little hole through and wear it as is, as a pendant. Or in this case, I have a colored piece of paper I'm going to add to the backing here. Now remember to test your paper ahead of time and cover it with a layer of decoupage glue if you need to keep the color from bleeding. I've prepared this piece ahead of time, and I'm going to go ahead and set that on top of the resin to dry. And then when I pop the design out, this will become the background piece. After you've pulled your completed resin piece from your mold and everything's been cured, I've finished this piece by drilling a hole through the top and then strung cord through and just completed it with this braided design to sort of match the look of the pendant. And you'll see that you can see the paper shining through and the transparency embedded in between. And this will complete your necklace on this project. This heart pendant is a variation of the dictionary beads that are made out of polymer clay. And I've made a polymer clay bezel in the shape of a heart to hold a resin and some images. The polymer clay was simply conditioned and then shaped into a heart, and then I just used my fingers to add a bezel wall around the edge so that it would hold my resin deeply. And then to add a hook at the top, like this one, to match the color of the polymer clay, I simply used a piece of telephone wire, made a loop and twisted it, and then just clipped this off. If you embed the twisted end deeply into your polymer clay, then it'll stay put after you've baked it. The polymer clay heart was then baked at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for a half an hour, and then it's ready to go, ready to fill with your images and resin. For these images, I've used just some computer fonts to make words, and then I used a little bit of antiquing around the edge, just a little bit of ink to create an antique look. And then I've covered both sides with Mod Podge to make sure I've sealed the paper because you don't want that to go clear in your resin. And then I have a few other little found objects, some beads and stampings, little things that you want to attach into your heart. Just use white glue. I'm using thin white glue to attach these words. Use a little bit of thicker glue to attach some of your heavier pieces. This glue is called Sobo, and I'm just using it to attach these little pieces. The heavier pieces work better with a thicker glue, but don't worry too much about the glue holding steady. Your resin will flow in around all of the objects and hold them in place. And use a toothpick to move things around if you need to. Actually, if you have some tweezers, that makes it easier to place things if they're little beads. And you can continue to add as many little objects or paper elements as you want. And let this dry overnight until all of the glue is clear. You want to make sure you don't have any left that will interfere with your resin. Set that aside to dry. After all of your pieces have dried and your glue is clear, you can tell that everything's thoroughly dry in here. I'm going to complete this heart by adding casting epoxy resin. And the resin will just flow in around the pieces that you have in your collage. I'm using casting epoxy on this project because my bezel's a little bit deeper. If you had a shallow bezel that was less than 1/4 inch deep, then you could go ahead and use coating resin as well. Also, if you have any air bubbles, go ahead and use a heat gun that is used for rubber stamps and pass it over the surface, and that'll help dissipate any bubbles that you have. Now to finish this off, to add a little bit of extra embellishment, I'm going to sprinkle a little glitter in here. And glitter, if it's a heavier glass type like I'm using, will sink into the resin. But if you use a little finer glitter, it'll float on top. So you can get a variation in depth and the look of your piece by the types of glitters that you use. Another trick is to wait for the resin to start to gel, and then your glitter will suspend in the resin. And I'll add a few beads. This gives it really a lot of dimension. Just adding little seed beads. And then if any of your pieces need help, you can move them with a toothpick at this stage while it's still uncured. You move the glitter around or any of the little pieces that you find that stray. And now this piece, when I'm done, will be ready to cure. And I'm going to let this sit in a warm place. Under a light bulb is really good too, for several days until that's cured. And to finish the piece, go ahead and use a chain or something to thread through the top of the loop, and you've got a completed pendant. This maple leaf was made with transparent resin backed with gold leaf to give it a glow that shines through the resin. And this can be made into a pin, or as an alternate, I've made a few discs that were in a mold and they were backed with either silver or gold leaf to shine through the resin to make pendants. To make this pin, I have a rubber mold that I made from a brass finding here, and this used the two-part putty that I've shown you on a previous project. And after the mold is done, it's very flexible and ready to pour resin into it. And I have a little bit of resin mixed up, and this is casting resin. And to color it, I'm going to add just a little bit of colorant. You don't want to add too much because you want to maintain the clear look. Adding a little bit of red and a little bit of blue to get a violet color. Mix it into your resin well. Make sure you scrape the sides of your cup when you're adding any kind of transparent dye or pigment. In this case, we're using dyes because they maintain a transparency, and they're the dyes that are recommended by the manufacturer of this resin. When you've got it thoroughly mixed, I'm ready to go ahead and pour it into my mold. Make sure not to overfill so you don't have it spilling over the edges. Use your craft stick or a toothpick to help get it into the little corners where it needs to go. And also as it cures, it will find its way into every little crack and pick up every detail that you have in the mold. Now as a final step, before I let that cure, I can hit it with a heat gun and pass it over real quickly and get rid of all those air bubbles, and then we'll set this aside to cure. And let that cure for several days until it is ready to flex out from the mold. I have this completed one, and this one you can tell that it's just lightly tinted with color, and that's been flexed out of my mold, and I'm ready to apply my gold leaf to the back of that. You can use thinned decoupage, medium, or in this case I'm using gold size, which is the glue that holds gold leaf in place. And you can find this wherever you find leafing gold leaf supplies. And just paint a thin layer on the back of your cured resin. While this size is wet, it will have a white appearance which will turn clear in about 10 or so minutes, and then you know you're ready to go ahead and apply your leaf. That's the stage when you want to start applying it, not while it's wet. Make sure you get it all around the edges so we can back the entire surface of the back of the leaf. Okay, and then we'll sit and we'll wait for that for a few minutes until it's ready to attach the leaf. After your size becomes clear and it's no longer cloudy, you'll know that it's ready, and it has a slight tack when you touch it. You can take your entire leaf and place it over the gold leaf, and it will pick it up. And then just use your fingers to remove the excess from the edge. In traditional leafing, you can use a soft brush too that will help remove. Now, if you have any little spots that need more leaf, take the gold and put little bits over it until you've covered the entire surface of the back of this leaf. I can just remove the excess with my fingers. Until you've removed all the little traces of gold around the edge. And you can already see that the gold is shining through the resin to give it a glow. After I've removed the gold leaf from my piece, I've got one here that's ready to attach a pin back. And I have a little bit more epoxy resin here. And take the resin and layer it on the back to seal the gold leaf, and then also to attach the pin back. So just put that resin on there. Just a thin layer is fine. You just want enough to back the gold leaf. Just move it around with your craft stick or toothpick if you need to get in the corners. You can find pin backs at jewelry suppliers or craft stores. And this one is just a brass colored one. And make sure you get all the edges. And then you just simply take your pin back and drop it there. Then as that cures, it will bond it in place to the back of your pin, and then you'll have your finished pin that looks like this one, and you can imagine all the different transparent colors you could use with either silver or gold leaf and all the variations you can come up with. I'm going to be using a 2-part silicone to make this bracelet that has little pieces of cured resin inside to add colorful elements around the bracelet. And to start, I'm going to use a purchased bracelet. I have this wooden one here, and I've glued it on the lid of a cottage cheese container. And you've cut the bottom half off of it, and you'll see that I've got this upside down and I'm just snapping the lid on. And this bracelet has just been glued onto the lid with a little bit of white glue and left to dry. And I'll be forming my mold around the bracelet to make a cast from it. Rubber silicone comes in a 2-part component, just like resin does. And you want to make sure you wear your respirator and your safety equipment when you're using this product. This product mixes 1 part to 1 part. So I'll go ahead and pour it into my cup. Now before you start, if you need to measure out how much you'll need to cover your object, you can fill your container with water, measure that, and then you know how much silicone rubber you need to mix up. And in this case, I'm going to use 6 ounces to cover this bracelet in this container. So I've got 3 ounces of one component and 3 ounces of the other. There's a part A and a part B. These cups have markings on the side of measurements that makes it really easy to measure accurately. The 2 parts get stirred together, and you want to mix this really well for about 3 minutes with a stir stick. Scraping the side of the container really helps to incorporate the 2 together, and continue mixing that for about a full 3 minutes. And just like resin, you want to make sure you don't whip it by incorporating a lot of air and air bubbles into the mold mixture. This cup is clear, so it makes it nice. I can see on the sides if I've got both parts mixed thoroughly. As soon as you've got both parts incorporated and you've stirred it for about 3 minutes, you're ready to pour it over your model. So take the rubber silicone and pour it into your mold. And you can just pour in one place, starting at the lowest point. I'll move over to the side so it can get around the side of the model. Let the rubber silicone just rise up around the bracelet that's inside until it's all covered. Keep pouring this until it covers it 1/4 inch above the highest spot of your model. Tap it lightly, just like you would with cake batter, to release the bubbles. And then sit this in a warm place for several hours to cure, and it won't take long, and the bubbles will continue to dissipate as you're letting it cure. And then as soon as it's cured, you will be able to remove your model and pour your original resin bangle. After I've poured and let the rubber set, you remove your lid from your container and just push the rubber out of your container like that. And then I'm going to remove my original model here. And you can remove any little stray bits of rubber that are hanging around the edges here. Just flex it out by pushing with your fingers around the mold. And I'll remove, just grab it from under here, and I'll remove it from my mold. And now this is ready to fill with resin. For this project, this is a neat way that you can save your leftover resin. I've just poured resin from other projects, and this is epoxy resin, onto pieces of wax paper and sprinkled a little glitter inside of it. And then you just peel them off of the wax paper. And if you use it within a day or so, they're still flexible. Your resin's still flexible, and you can cut it up into little shapes. That one's a little rigid. I've got a couple of pieces here, and I just use sharp scissors to cut the resin into little pieces. You can cut little thin strips or little squares or any geometric shape that you might want to. If you pour your resin really thin, you can even cut more intricate shapes. I'm just cutting little bits of resin. The nice thing is it won't stick to the wax paper, and so you have a nice way to peel your resin off. It also helps you so that you don't have to pour all these different colors of resin at one time when you're working on a project. And I think I'll cut this pink one into long strips. And continue with as many little pieces as you want to fill your bracelet with. Now on this bracelet, you can use clear epoxy casting resin or urethane casting resin. On this one, I will use a little bit of urethane resin. And I have my two parts, my part A and my part B. And this particular formulation is crystal clear because I want to be able to see those fun, embedded, colorful bits of resin when I'm done. I'm only mixing a little bit to begin with because I'm going to be filling this mold half full so that all of my embedded pieces will be at different levels in the bracelet and they won't all sink to one level. Stir this really well. You have about 30 seconds to mix the two components before it starts to gel. For this project, it's really helpful if you have a resin that gels fairly quickly if you want to speed up the process, because you can add those pieces as it gels and it will help suspend them so they all don't sink to the bottom of the bracelet, or it should be the top when you pull it out of the mold. If you wanted, you could add a little bit of a tint, a little bit of dye to this and get a little bit of extra color. It would be a neat effect. And maybe pour in layers too would be another idea. As soon as I've scraped my cup well and I have that thoroughly mixed, I'm going to pour it into my mold. And just start on one side of the mold and pour it. And I'm filling that one about half full. The great thing about urethane resin too is it releases the bubbles nicely. Take your little pieces and strips, and I'm going to go ahead and put these long strips in around the edge. And I'll put a few of these green squares around the edge. And even if I wait a few minutes, this will start to gel and it'll help suspend the pieces along the edge so they don't sink down too badly. And a few purple ones. If I wanted to add a little bit of glitter or sequins, I can do that as well. See if I've got them. And if you need to move anything at this point, you can stick a toothpick in and scoot them around. And we'll just let that gel for a bit before we add our next layer of resin. After my first layer of poured resin starts to gel, I can add the rest to complete the bangle. And I've mixed up another batch of the two-part resin really well. And pour this in the same way to fill it to the top of the mold. Fill your mold to the top with your mixed resin. And it's important that you add your second layer at the point where your first layer has just gelled, because if you wait too long, if you wait a few days, then your resin begins to shrink away from the side of the mold, and then your new resin will find its way around the edge. Now with clear, that's not a problem, but if you have different colors such as stripes or something, you want to maintain the stripes in the mold so that you don't have resin seeping around the edges. That resin gels really quickly, so within a few hours you're ready to go ahead and add your next layer. So that's always a good idea to make sure that your layers stay where they're supposed to. And I can add a few more bits now. Get in there. This is probably when I'll need a little stick to get them in there. This allows me to add lots of embedded pieces at different layers in the bracelet. And continue until you've got all the little pieces that you want to embed in there. Let this sit overnight and then you'll be ready to release it from the mold. So I have my finished piece here. And you can tell that the resin is pure by just tapping on it with a stick and you hear that click. And you know that it's ready to release from the mold. If you have any little stray areas where the rubber seeped into the bottom of the mold where the glue was, you can just remove that with your fingers, or sometimes take a little blade of an X-Acto knife around the edge or scissors to remove any material that went over the edge and is in the way of getting your finished resin out of the mold. And this mold is very flexible, and so you can just pull it out from around the bangle, flex the middle section out, to flex it out, pushing on it. Work gently so you don't tear your mold. And then I have my finished piece with my embedded bits in it, and this is ready to go ahead and sand and refine the edges to complete the bracelet. This bangle was made with polymer clay as a model, and I used polymer clay to form a freeform design bangle, which then was cast using rubber silicone for a mold. And then after the mold was cured, I poured new resin into the mold to cast multiples for this design. And it's fun because you can use polymer clay to make a bangle of any design or shape that you want and make replicas of it. So to get started, I'm going to use a purchased bangle so that I know the size of the bangle that I need to make. And I've got a purchased bangle here, and I'm going to, on a piece of paper, just trace the inside with a pen or pencil. And that gives me a pattern for the inside of my bracelet. And then I used polymer clay to make this design, and I've made it to fit around that circle for the inside so that it'll fit over your wrist when it's completed. The type of clay that I used to make this was either Primo or Sculpey brand clay. And the reason these brands are great to use is because they are sulfur-free clays, and these allow you to cast with the rubber silicone without getting any reaction from the polymer clay. So anytime you're using clays with a mold material, try to ask for or make sure that it's sulfur-free, whether it be a plasticine or a polymer clay. And then this was baked in an oven devoted for polymer clay at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes to harden the polymer clay to get ready for my mold. And I made sure that I refined everything and sanded any imperfections that I needed out prior to making the casting. And after I've baked that, I can pour my mold. In the bangle project, I showed you how to make a rubber silicone mold, and this was made using the same type of mold. Only on this one, I had to use a larger container because the bracelet needed to fit down in here so that you had room with all of these little protrusions on the bracelet. I needed to make sure I had a little bit of room around the bracelet so that mold material could flow around that. So I formed it in a larger container like this with the lid, and then the finished mold looks like this one. And now to pour the resin. On this project, I'm going to use a fast curing polyurethane resin. And it's mixed very similarly to epoxy resins where it's a 1-to-1 mixture, which makes it easy to work with. And to color the bracelet, I have some pigment powder here. And make sure that when you're working with pigment powders that you wear a dust mask because you don't want to be breathing those powders. This urethane comes in a A and a B mixture, and the manufacturer suggests that you mix your pigment with part A first. And if you start with just a little bit, you can get these grains mixed in really well, the pigment grains. You'll notice that on my finished piece, I have a few specks on it where the pigment didn't quite mix in. And it's kind of a fun look, a little bit of a speckle to the bracelet, but if you want a uniform look, then go ahead and try to mix this pigment in really well. And I'll use the rest of that and mix it really well. Pigments come in either dry form, like the one I just showed you, or liquid form that are made for the resin that they're used with. Or you can use dyes if you want a transparent bracelet. This design would look really, really fun with a transparent look to it. And you could embed little beads or sequins or whatever you want in that design. After you have your pigment mixed in, I can mix my two parts together to combine them. And make sure you get equal amounts in both. And then use a stir stick to combine these. This resin is really fast to set up, so you only have about 30 seconds to stir this before it starts to polymerize and heat up. Your fingers will feel the warmth start to happen as the chemical reaction takes place. And now I'm ready to pour this into my mold. And just start on one side and let a stream of resin fill the mold. If you pour like this, you're more likely not to get as many air bubbles because I'm just letting this slow stream fill up the mold rather than hurrying and moving the cup around, which might trap air bubbles in the design. Let it rise up to the top of your opening here. And this resin sets up so quickly you can watch the reaction take place, and we can just watch it for a minute and you'll notice that it'll start to turn opaque within 3 minutes. After your resin has set, you can tell that this has become opaque. Then you will know it's ready to remove from your mold as soon as it makes a clicking sound as soon as you tap on it with a little stick, and it'll sound like tapping on plastic like that. So we will go ahead and let this sit aside for a few hours and it'll be ready to release from the mold. After your rubber mold has cured completely, you can see that it's flexible and this has been cured. I can release my poured cast bangle out of the mold and just flex it out by going around the edges, pushing on the mold. And if I can get a little bit of the edge of it, I can push this through to release the bracelet. And you'll see that I have this cast piece that I finished that looks just like my original polymer clay model that I used for the mold. And now at this stage, you're ready to go ahead and sand off all of these edges and refine the bracelet so that it'll be perfectly smooth on both sides to make your completed bangle. For this bracelet, I'm using clear resin, acrylic paint, and opaque resin. Whoops. Use paper images behind these little model train people. I don't want to call them model train people. Another type of stone that you can make is lapis lazuli. How do I say that? Lazuli, right? Lazuli. Lazuli. I'll find the place where it was. It's like a puzzle. I will find.